Peter Twiss levelled the Fairey Delta II at 38,000 feet above Chichester on March 10, 1956. The Rolls-Royce Avon RA.14R, burning kerosene, at a rate that gave him minutes, not hours, to complete the run. The aircraft was small, 26 feet 10 inches long, a wingspan under 27 feet. With a needle nose that drooped downward for takeoff and landing, an engineering solution born of the Delta wing's brutal geometry. Twiss pushed the throttle through the gate and lit the reheat. The measured course ran between Ford and Chichester, 15 kilometres of Sussex sky, monitored by Kine theodolites operated by the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. On the first pass, he clocked 1,117 miles per hour. On the second, into the reciprocal, 1,147. The averaged figure, corrected for temperature and altitude, was 1,132 miles per hour. Mach 1.731, the previous record held by Colonel Horace Haynes of the United States Air Force in an F-100 Super Sabre, was 822 miles per hour. Twiss had beaten it by more than 300 miles per hour, the largest margin in the history of the absolute world airspeed record. The Fédération Aéronautique Internationale ratified the flight on March 22nd. Fairey Aviation issued a photograph of Twiss standing beside WG-774, the second of two prototypes built under Ministry of Supply Contract 6/ACFT/1873. In Whitehall, the Air Ministry drafted a congratulatory telegram. In the American press, there was disbelief. The Delta II was a research aircraft funded under Specification ER.103, and no one outside a small circle at Fairey's Hayes Works, the RAE, and the ministry had expected it to fly faster than anything the Convair or North American programs were producing at Muroc. The Americans had F-104s in development. The Soviets were flying the E-2, which would evolve into the MiG-21. Britain, whose aircraft industry had emerged from 1945 with more design bureau than the United States and the Soviet Union combined, had just demonstrated that it could still outpace both. Twiss received the Queen's Commendation for valuable service in the air. The Seagrave Trophy followed. Fairey's managing director, Sir Richard Fairey, wrote privately to the Minister of Supply, Reginald Maudling, arguing that the Delta II had proven the aerodynamic case for a Mach 2 interceptor and that a production variant could be flying in 3 years. The letter was filed. Within 18 months, the government would publish a white paper that made Fairey's argument irrelevant. The record itself lasted until December 12, 1957, when Major Adrian Drew of the USAF flew a McDonnell F-101A Voodoo to 1,207 miles per hour over Edwards Air Force Base. By then, the Delta II program was already being dismantled in a way that had nothing to do with the Americans. Duncan Sandys, Minister of Defence, had signed off on the Statement on Defence, 1957, presented to Parliament on April 4th. It ran to 28 pages. Paragraph 61 stated that work on such projects would be stopped. The English Electric Lightning, already in advanced flight test, was permitted to continue because cancellation costs would have exceeded completion costs. The Delta II, having no production contract, had nothing to cancel and no future. Twiss flew WG-774 for a further 2 years on a diminishing schedule of research sorties. In the Fairey drawing office at Hayes, a team led by Robert Lickley was already sketching what the Delta II might have become. A naval strike fighter designated ER.103C, and later a supersonic interceptor. Neither would leave the drawing board. The 1957 Defence White Paper was Sandys' document, but the reasoning behind it had been circulating in Whitehall for at least 3 years. Sir Anthony Eden's government, before it collapsed in the ruin of Suez, had commissioned a review by Sir Richard Powell at the Ministry of Defence, which concluded that Britain could no longer afford the full spectrum of conventional forces and an independent nuclear deterrent. The Treasury under Peter Thornycroft was blunter. The defence budget, at 10% of GDP, was crowding out everything else. something had to be cut. Sandys, who had run the V2 investigation in 1944 and who believed in guided missiles with the conviction of a convert, decided that manned aircraft were the redundant technology. Paragraph 61 of the White Paper stated that the Royal Air Force would receive no new manned fighters after the Lightning, and that surface-to-air guided missiles, Bloodhound and Thunderbird, would take over the air defence of the United Kingdom. Paragraph 62 extended the same logic to bombers. The V-Force would be the last, replaced eventually by ballistic missiles. Sandys presented the case to Cabinet on March 27, 1957. Harold Macmillan, who had become Prime Minister 2 months earlier, backed him. The vote was carried. The consequences for the British aircraft industry were immediate and structural. Fairey Aviation lost its rationale as an independent manufacturer. Its rotorcraft division, which had produced the Rotodyne, would struggle on until 1962. The fixed-wing side was absorbed into Westland in 1960 as part of the government-mandated consolidation that also folded Bristol into BAC and Blackburn into Hawker Siddeley. The Delta II program, which had produced 2 airframes at a cost of roughly £750,000, was not so much cancelled as orphaned. WG 774 was transferred to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Bedford. WG 777 went to Farnborough. Sandys' critics, and there were many, argued that he had misread the technology. Guided missiles in 1957 could not track low-level intruders, could not be reloaded quickly, and could not perform the visual identification tasks that the Cold War rules of engagement required. Air Chief Marshal Sir Dermot Boyle, Chief of the Air Staff, wrote to Sandys in April, protesting that the White Paper's assumptions were unproven. Sandys did not reply. The Lightning entered service in 1960 as the last British-designed supersonic interceptor to reach the RAF. Its successor, the Phantom, was American. For Fairey, the White Paper was terminal but not immediately fatal. In 1959, the company proposed a modified Delta II to the Ministry of Supply for research into the aerodynamics of slender wings, the configuration then being studied for a supersonic transport project that would eventually become Concorde. WG 774 was returned to Hayes, fitted with a new ogival wing designed by the RAE, a longer forward fuselage and modified undercarriage. It flew again on June 1, 1964 as the BAC 221, a piece of hardware that the company that had built it no longer existed to claim. Fairey Aviation had been wound up. Its research contract was completed under the BAC name. The 221 flew from Filton and Boscombe Down for 5 years, gathering data that informed the wing design of Concorde 001. It was by then an anonymous instrument in someone else's program. The record run of March 1956 belonged to a company that no longer existed, an aircraft category that had been declared obsolete, and a moment of technical confidence that Whitehall had spent the intervening years methodically dismantling. The intelligence dimension of the Delta 2-story runs beneath the public record and only surfaces intermittently. The Joint Intelligence Committee had, since 1949, produced an annual assessment of Soviet air capability, drawing on SIGINT from GCHQ at Eastcote and later Cheltenham, on HUMINT from MI5 stations in Berlin and Vienna, and on the interpretation of imagery from RAF reconnaissance flights along the Baltic and Black Sea peripheries. By 1955, the JIC's estimate of Soviet fighter development was that Mikoyan and Sukhoi were within 2 years of a Mach 2 interceptor. This assessment shaped the Ministry of Supply's willingness to fund research aircraft like the Delta II, and it was cited internally by Fairey's advocates in the ministry as justification for continued investment. The 1955 estimate was, as later revealed, roughly correct. The MiG-21 first flew in prototype form as the Yi-2 in February 1955, and as the Delta-winged Yi-4 in June. British intelligence did not know the aircraft's designation, its power plant, or its dimensions, but the JIC's July 1955 paper, JIC 55, 57 assessed that a new generation Soviet fighter was in flight test. The paper was circulated to the Chiefs of Staff and to the Air Ministry. It reached Sandy's office in December 1956. His marginalia, preserved in the Cabinet Office files at Kew, indicate that he read it and dismissed its operational implications. His view was that whatever the Soviets flew, the answer was ground-launched missiles, not counterfighters. The Americans took a different view. In the aftermath of Twiss's record flight, the US Air Attaché in London, Colonel Elwood Quesada Jr., requested detailed briefings on the Delta II. The Ministry of Supply, following standing procedure, referred the request to the Foreign Office, which referred it to the Cabinet Office's Joint Technical Intelligence Committee. The internal correspondence held in DEFE 32 at the National Archives shows that Britain provided the Americans with aerodynamic data and some performance figures, but withheld the reheat characteristics of the RA.14R engine and the specific configuration of the intake. This was standard practice, cooperation, but not full disclosure. Whether the Soviets acquired information on the Delta II through espionage is a question historians have handled cautiously. The Portland spy ring, run from 1955 by Conon Mollody under the alias Gordon Lonsdale, was primarily targeted at the Admiralty underwater weapons establishment. Klaus Fuchs had been arrested in 1950. George Blake, whose betrayal of MI6 operations from 1953 onward caused catastrophic damage, was not primarily involved in aeronautical intelligence. The most likely conduit, if there was one, was open source. The FAI's ratification documents, published aviation press, and the technical papers Fairey submitted to the Royal Aeronautical Society. The Soviets had access to all of this without needing an agent. What the intelligence record shows more clearly is the reverse flow. In August 1957, an RAF Canberra of 192 Squadron flying an electronic intelligence sortie along the East German frontier detected radar emissions consistent with a new Soviet fighter guidance system. The material was passed to GCHQ and analysed by the Air Warfare Analysis Section at Uxbridge. The conclusion, filed as AWAS/57/119, was that the Soviets were fielding a supersonic interceptor within 18 months. The paper was distributed to the Air Ministry and the Ministry of Supply. By then, the White Paper had been in force for 4 months, and the RAF's future had already been reordered around missiles that could not yet track the aircraft the JIC now knew existed. Sandy's ministry filed the paper without comment. The Delta II, which might have been the airframe on which a British answer was built, was already halfway to Bedford. The commercial history of the Delta II is a study in what did not happen. Between 1956 and 1958, Fairey attempted 4 times to convert the research aircraft into a production program. The first attempt in July 1956 was a proposal to the Royal Australian Air Force for a license-built interceptor designated the Fairey Delta III. The RAAF was then evaluating replacements for its Avon Sabres. Fairey's brochure promised a Mach 2 aircraft capable of operating from short runways at Butterworth. The RAAF's technical staff visited Hayes in September 1956, flew as passengers in the second prototype, and returned to Canberra recommending further evaluation. In February 1957, Australia announced it would buy the Dassault Mirage 3 instead. The Australian decision was made partly on cost and partly on the assessment that the French were further ahead in productionization. The second attempt was directed at Switzerland, which was then seeking a supersonic fighter to replace its de Havilland Venoms. Fairey submitted a proposal in November 1956. The Swiss evaluation conducted at Emmen favoured the Saab Draken and later the Mirage 3. Fairey's proposal did not reach the shortlist. The third attempt targeted West Germany's replacement program for the F-84F Thunderstreak. Fairey's Delta III competed against the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter, the Northrop N-156 and the Grumman Super Tiger. In November 1958, the Bundestag selected the F-104. The German decision, later the subject of prolonged controversy over Lockheed's payments to defense officials, ended Fairey's export prospects. The fourth attempt was internal. In January 1959, Fairey's technical director, Herbert Chaplin, submitted an unsolicited proposal to the Air Ministry for a Delta III development to meet Operational Requirement F.155, which had itself been cancelled in the 1957 White Paper, but which the RAF's air staff continued informally to want filled. The proposal was rejected within 6 weeks. The formal reason given was that no requirement existed. The informal reason communicated to Chaplin by Air Vice Marshal Kyle at the Air Ministry was that Sandys would not permit any new manned combat aircraft program to begin. Chaplin retired the following year. The company itself was in decline. Fairey's turnover fell from £14.2 million in 1956 to £8.7 million in 1959. Its workforce at Hayes and Heaton Chapel contracted from 8,000 to 4,600. The Rotodyne project, a compound helicopter that had performed a demonstration flight into Battersea Heliport in 1959, was cancelled in February 1962 when British European Airways declined to place an order. The Ministry of Aviation, which had part-funded the Rotodyne, terminated its contribution. Fairey Aviation ceased to exist as an aircraft manufacturer in June 1960, absorbed by Westland in a merger engineered by the government. Its manufacturing sites were sold. The Hayes Works, which had built Swordfish, Fireflies and Delta IIs, was demolished progressively through the 1960s. The two Delta II airframes outlived their maker. WG-774 flew as the BAC-221 until 1973. WG-777 was retained by the RAE at Farnborough for lower speed research, then transferred to the RAF Museum at Cosford in 1969, where it remains. The 221 is at the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton. Neither aircraft is displayed with any prominence. Visitors walk past them to reach the Concords, the V-bombers, the aircraft that carried the weight of the story Britain preferred to tell about itself. The record, meanwhile, had passed westward and stayed there. No British aircraft has held the absolute world airspeed record since December 12, 1957. The political consequences of the 1957 White Paper played out slowly and disguised themselves as other decisions. In 1960, Britain cancelled Blue Streak, the intermediate-range ballistic missile that Sandys had designated as the successor to the V-Force. The cancellation was announced by Watkinson, the new Defence Minister, on April 13, 1960. Britain then arranged to buy the American Skybolt air-launched ballistic missile, which the Kennedy administration cancelled unilaterally in December 1962. Macmillan flew to Nassau to meet Kennedy on December 18th. The Nassau Agreement signed on December 21st secured Polaris in place of Skybolt. The submarine launch deterrent that resulted was operationally excellent and politically expensive. It committed Britain to a single American technology on American schedules for the remainder of the Cold War. The aircraft industry that had produced the Delta II was, by then, effectively nationalized in structure, if not in name. The mergers of 1960 consolidated 20-odd firms into two, British Aircraft Corporation and Hawker Siddeley. The TSR-2 program, a supersonic strike aircraft that survived the 1957 White Paper because it had been reclassified as a strategic system, was cancelled by the Wilson government on April 6, 1965. Dennis Healey, the new Defence Secretary, announced the decision in the Commons. Britain would buy the American F-111 instead. The F-111 order was cancelled in 1968, leaving the RAF with the Buccaneer and, from 1969, the Phantom. The pattern was consistent. British designs of the 1950s, Delta II, TSR-2 HP115, Vulcan Victor, represented a technical culture that could not be sustained on the budgets successive governments were willing to provide. When the Rolls-Royce RB545 engine was proposed in the 1980s for the Hotoll spaceplane, the same problem recurred: technical brilliance without the industrial and political scaffolding to carry it through to production. Hotoll was cancelled in 1988. The one project that broke the pattern was Concorde. It broke it partly because it was Anglo-French and partly because both governments discovered that the cancellation clauses were more expensive than continuation. The wing tests conducted with the BAC-221, the reincarnated WG-774, contributed to the Concorde program's aerodynamic validation. The Delta II in this reading was not so much cancelled as digested, absorbed into a joint program where its British origins became one input among many. Sandys himself never repudiated the 1957 White Paper. In a Lord's debate in November 1972, by which time he was a peer and Concorde was in flight test, he defended the missile-based logic of his defence policy on the grounds that it had prevented British bankruptcy. His critics pointed out that Britain had bought Polaris, Phantom, F-4K, F-4M, Sea King, Chinook, and eventually the Trident missile system from American sources, and that the aircraft industry, which might have supplied domestic alternatives, had been dismantled with the White Paper as its instrument. Sandys did not concede the point. The alternative history, the one in which the Delta II became a production interceptor, in which Fairey survived, in which Britain retained a supersonic combat aircraft design capability into the 1970s, was made structurally impossible by the decisions of 1957 to 1965. The Delta II's record run belonged to the last moment before that impossibility set in. Twiss himself continued as a test pilot with Fairey until 1959, then joined Fairey Marine and later worked with James Bond film production, flying the boats in From Russia with Love. He lived until 2011. The Bedford chapter of WG-774's life is the least documented and the most instructive. Between 1957 and 1961, the aircraft flew from the Royal Aircraft Establishment's airfield at Thurley on a research program investigating the aerodynamics of slender delta wings at supersonic speeds. The work was funded by the Ministry of Aviation under a research budget, separate from any weapons program. The pilots were RAE staff, R.J. Falk, R.G. Ovens and others whose names appear in the RAE's technical reports and in the logbooks held at the Fast Museum at Farnborough. The immediate customer for the data was the Supersonic Transport Aircraft Committee, chaired by Morian Morgan, which had been established in November 1956, and which reported in March 1959, with a recommendation that Britain proceed with the development of a Mach 2 civil airliner. Morgan's committee drew on Delta II flight data to argue that the aerodynamic problems of sustained supersonic cruise were tractable. The report went to the Ministry of Supply, then to the Cabinet Office. Cabinet approval for feasibility funding followed in October 1959. The Anglo-French Treaty on Concorde was signed on November 29, 1962 by Julian Amery for Britain and Robert Buren for France. It contained no break clause, a fact that would embarrass successive chancellors, including Jim Callaghan and Roy Jenkins, both of whom looked into the possibility of withdrawal, and were advised by Treasury Counsel that the treaty's structure made unilateral cancellation legally and financially prohibitive. The Delta II's contribution to this trajectory was indirect but real. The aircraft had demonstrated that a British firm could achieve sustained supersonic performance with a slender delta configuration, and that demonstration underpinned the technical confidence of the Morgan Committee. In April 1960, the Ministry of Aviation issued a study contract to Fairey and Hawker Siddeley for a low-speed research aircraft to complement Delta II data at approach speeds. This became the Handley Page HP115, which first flew in August 1961. The BAC-221, the modified WG-774, was designated to provide the high-speed complement. Between them, the two aircraft covered the flight envelope Concorde would need to traverse from takeoff to Mach 2 cruise. WG-774's rebuild at Filton took from 1961 to 1963. The Ogilvie wing, designed by Dietrich Kuschermann and Erich Maskell at the RAE, was fitted. A new nose section extended the fuselage by 6 feet, and the undercarriage was lengthened to accommodate the higher angle of attack. The rebuilt aircraft was rolled out in April 1964 and made its first flight on May 1st, flown by Godfrey Auty from Filton. Test flying continued until June 1973. In nearly a decade of research operation, the 221 accumulated 340 flying hours and provided data on wing loading, drag rise, and pitch stability that the Concorde design team incorporated into the production wing. None of this was public knowledge in any operationally useful sense. The 221 appeared in aviation press coverage as an oddity, an old record breaker in strange plumage, and was rarely photographed. It flew at Boscombe Down and Fairford, not at airshows. Its test schedule was determined by the Concorde Programme Office, which by 1966 had moved to Filton and Toulouse. When the last research flight was completed on June 9, 1973, no ceremony marked it. The aircraft was flown to Yeovilton and handed over to the Fleet Air Arm Museum. By that date, Concorde 002 had flown the Paris to Rio route in 8 hours. The Delta II had been in existence for 20 years. Its record still stood as the largest single-flight margin of improvement in the history of the FAI's absolute speed record. The forgetting was not accidental. It was, in a specific sense, structural. British aviation history in the Cold War is written around 3 pivots: the V-Force, TSR-2, and Concorde. The Delta II fits none of these narratives cleanly. It was too small, too specialized, and too commercially unsuccessful to feature in the story of the deterrent. It was not cancelled dramatically in the Commons as TSR-2 was. It was not a triumph of European cooperation as Concorde became. It was an English delta-winged research aircraft that did one exceptional thing and was then absorbed into a program that told a different story. The Fairey Company's own archives suffered the fate of most disbanded British aircraft firms: partial preservation, scattering, and loss. Some material went to the RAF Museum at Hendon. Some went to the National Aerospace Library at Farnborough. Much was destroyed when the Hayes works were cleared. The 2 Delta II airframes survived because they were on RAE strength when Fairey went out of business, and RAE assets were transferred systematically to museum collections in the 1960s and 1970s. WG-777 arrived at Cosford in September 1967. WG-774, as the BAC-221, followed to Yeovilton in 1973. Peter Twiss wrote a memoir, Faster Than the Sun, published by MacDonald in 1963. It sold moderately and went out of print. A revised edition appeared in 2000, published by Grub Street, by which time Twiss was in his 80s and living in retirement in Hampshire. He continued to attend Fairey Aviation Society reunions until shortly before his death on August 31, 2011, at the age of 90. The obituaries in the Times and Telegraph noted the record, but did not analyse the political context that had ensured it remained the only Fairey Delta II achievement of consequence. The academic literature on the 1957 White Paper is by contrast substantial. Peter Hennessy, in Muzzled Watchdogs and The Secret State, examined the Sandys reforms as part of a broader argument about the post-war British states' overreach and retrenchment. Lawrence Freedman's Britain and Nuclear Weapons treated the White Paper as the moment when Britain committed to a nuclear-only deterrent posture. Christopher Andrews' Defence of the Realm covered the intelligence dimension in outline. Matthew Grant's After the Bomb dealt with the White Paper's civil defence implications. None of these works discussed the Delta II in detail. The aircraft was a footnote to a policy story, and the policy story treated aircraft as a category the White Paper had made obsolete. The industrial consequences were catalogued more thoroughly in Keith Hayward's work on the British aircraft industry, and in the memoirs of designers like Sidney Cam and W.E.W. Petter, both of whom worked at firms that survived where Fairey did not. Hayward's assessment, published in 1989, was that the 1957 White Paper had not so much killed the British combat aircraft industry as accelerated a contraction that would have occurred anyway on demographic and economic grounds. Britain simply did not have the industrial base to sustain the design and production of first-rank combat aircraft, alongside a nuclear deterrent, a Rhine army, and a fleet of aircraft carriers. The counter-argument made by Bill Gunston and other aviation historians was that Sandys had chosen to accelerate that contraction rather than manage it, and that the loss of design capability was cumulative and irreversible. Once a drawing office was closed, the engineers dispersed. Once dispersed, they could not be reassembled. WG-777 sits under the roof of the National Cold War Exhibition at Cosford, painted in the pale grey it wore for its Farnborough test career, its droop nose fixed in the up position. The interpretive board next to it records the March 1956 record and the aircraft's transfer to research duties. It does not record the arguments Herbert Chaplin lost, or the Rotterdam and Melbourne export campaigns that failed, or the letter Sir Richard Fairey wrote to Reginald Maudling. The aircraft is displayed near a Victor, a Vulcan, and a Lightning, three aircraft that carried the burden of the deterrent Sandys chose to build. The other Delta II, WG-774, still wearing its BAC-221 modifications, is at Yeovilton in a hangar dedicated to naval aviation. It looks stranger than WG-777. Its ogival wing and lengthened fuselage giving it a resemblance to a small Concorde. The label describes its role in Concorde research. The connection to the March 1956 record is mentioned briefly. Twiss's own summary, delivered in interviews with the RAF Historical Society in the 1990s and preserved in the Society's journal, was that the Delta II had done what it was designed to do. It had proved that a British firm working with British engines could produce an aircraft faster than anything the Americans or Soviets were flying. What it could not do, what no aircraft could do, was persuade a government committed to missiles and to Treasury arithmetic that continued investment in manned combat aviation was affordable. Twiss did not blame Sandys personally. He blamed the calculation. The March 1956 record has not been beaten by a British aircraft. The absolute world airspeed record was set at 2,193.16 miles per hour on July 28, 1976, by Captain Eldon Jewess in an SR-71A Blackbird, and it still stands. The British holder of the absolute record in the 50 years between Twiss's flight and the present was Twiss alone, for 21 months. The Lightning, which entered service in 1960, was capable of Mach 2 but was not offered for record attempts. The TSR-2 might have been had it survived. Concorde, in the civil category, set records of its own. The North Atlantic in 2 hours 52 minutes on February 7th, 1996. But Concorde was not an airspeed aircraft. It was a scheduled airliner in a category the FAI does not recognize for absolute records. What the Delta II story reveals in the end is a specific kind of British choice. Faced with the Cold War as a technological and financial problem, Whitehall chose to concentrate its diminishing resources on the deterrent, on the Rhine Army, and on the alliance with Washington. The industrial capacity to build fast aeroplanes was allowed to atrophy because it did not fit the strategic account. The March 1956 record was, in that sense, a demonstration of a capability Britain had already decided to give up. Fairey Aviation's records, what remains of them, are held at the RAF Museum and at the National Aerospace Library. The Delta II file at Q AVIA 6/22458 contains the Ministry of Supply's original specification and the correspondence with the RAE covering the record attempt. It is a slim folder. The Sandys papers at Churchill College, Cambridge are more voluminous. Between the two, the Delta II story sits in the archives, waiting for the researcher who wants to read it not as a technical footnote, but as a case study in how a country decides what it will and will not build. Peter Twiss's flying suit is in the collection at Yeovilton. His logbooks are with the family.